This is the lecture for Tuesday, the 11th of January, 2022. And yesterday we saw some of the transitions from cottage industry to early textile mills. And textiles, clothing, cloth, fiber, wool, thread, etc., were the first places where industrialization and its methods were tried in Britain. And then eventually they came to New England and to Germany. But Britain was by far and ahead in the lead. Now, some of the things from yesterday that you're going to be expected to notice. First, a factory drivetrain. It all involves torsional force or twistiness. Torsional force or twistiness. So you have a river with a waterfall. That waterfall is going to create kinetic energy downward. How are you going to turn that kinetic energy into mechanical energy? Well, what you do is you make sure that at the top of the waterfall there is enough of a dam to create a mill pond. It doesn't stop the river, but it does keep a reserve of water upstream of that waterfall. Then you dig a small canal, and the canal has a drop, and where that drop is, or just in front of the drop, you place your water wheel. And the water wheel is the hub of the mill. Water goes through, falls down, turning the water wheel thusly. The water wheel is connected to an axle, turning thusly in the same fashion. That axle is connected to the main shaft by a gear. It turns like this, and through the gear, the central shaft turns like this. The central shaft, doing this badly because my left arm is my stupid arm, except for writing. The main shaft turns thusly, and near the ceiling of every floor, the main shaft has a gear that turns ceiling shafts. Now, there's a central ceiling shaft. There may be connecting side ceiling shafts, all connected through a network of gears and axles on every level, along every part of the floor. These ceiling axles, which turn, are connectable by leather straps, leather loops, like a rubber band made of leather, to devices, like sewing machines, like lathes, like any other mechanical device you want. The torsional force, or turning energy, is going to create the movement within the mechanism that sews the fabric or makes the cloth or whatever it does. So everything is connected by gears and by struts, by axles. There's no electricity. It's all mechanical or kinetic or torsional energy. It is the energy of turning things. That is still the energy force that we use today. In the most advanced nuclear reactors, it isn't the nuclear reaction that directly produces electricity. We don't do that yet. The closest we get is in a hydrogen bomb, where you have a conversion to energy. But within a power plant, whether it's on an atomic submarine or a nuclear power plant that powers the power grid of a city, what happens is the atomic pile heats water. The water creates steam. The steam turns turbines. And those turning turbines, through magnetism, creates electricity. So, our most advanced fission nuclear power plants are nothing more than updated, modernized steam engines. And those steam engines work through torsional or turning force from the kinetic energy of the rising steam. Not fundamentally different from the early mills. Now, of course, if something went wrong, and something stopped a gear or caused a gear to seize up, you're talking a potential for major mechanical damage because everything is based on the turning and interlocking of gears. And if something goes kablooey, you could have snapping and destroyed machinery, and there were people who were injured or killed. Also, if you have a machine operated by the turning energy of a leather strap and you accidentally slip your finger in, you can't just, it's not so easy to unplug. You can slide the strap off, but by that point your hand has been ground into mush. I worked in a factory with 1842 equipment. I took a semester off from college at the beginning of my junior year. And to support myself, one of the jobs I had was as a security guard. And the company sent me from Lewiston, where I was living, which is where my college was, Lewiston, Maine, north about 45 minutes to a hole-in-the-wall village called Monmouth, Maine. And one part of Monmouth, Maine has a theater, and it's artsy and beautiful. That wasn't the part I worked in. The part I worked in was North Monmouth, Maine, which was built around a factory or a mill that had been built in the early 1840s. The mill was the center of a community that had lasted from the 1840s until the 1980s, where I was working there. It still exists. In this village, the descendants of workers who've been there for 6 generations are still working in this mill. Now, today, the mill is owned by Tex-Tech Industries, and it produces the fuzzy stuff that go on tennis balls. Somebody's got to make it, and it's good business for them. But in the older parts of the mill, you still had the original equipment. You still had the shafts and gears and leather straps. I was basically security watch during the day and during the night there on weekends. And so I had the privilege of seeing the place when it was operating during the day with workers, and that after they left, of wandering this place at night. It was incredible for a historian, for a student of history, to smell this place. And it had a fragrance of generations of sweat, the fragrance of natural fabric or of natural fiber that's going to be turned into something. The smell, eventually they stopped using their water wheel and they started using an old steam engine made with oil. And the smell of the oil in the boiler room. After I returned to college, I set up a field trip for my classmates who had never, many of them, seen anything like this, those children of privilege. It's industry of that era has a certain quality. Every age has its own aesthetic. Every age has its own feeling. But the mechanisms of early industry in a water wheel mill, the little wooden bobbins, the intricacies of the machinery, it is something to behold. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to an old factory or go to an old mill, either as a tourist or as a worker, and I worked in modern factories when I was working my way through night school. I worked for LL Bean as an order set processor. And that was an absolutely ultra-modern computerized factory facility in the mid-1990s. And it was totally different. But it was also a factory floor production facility. So I got a chance to see the beginning of the story in Monmouth, Maine, and the end of the story in Freeport, Maine. Or actually, I think that place was in Yarmouth. No, it was in Freeport. How industry had come, how far it had come. And I'm trying to explain to you things that are difficult to put into words. There's a poetry to understanding the past. You can feel it when you grasp an old sword or see an old tapestry or a chair or a table or something that was made. While I was working for the security company when I took that semester off, I lived in an apartment that was basically the second floor of a house that had been built in the, again, the mid-18 teens when the Bates Mill was first set up in Lewiston, Maine. Bates Mill, the owner set up Bates College, where I went. And this was not fundamentally refurbished. They had put in steam heat around the turn of the 20th century, but that's about it. They had electrified the place probably in the 1940s or 50s. But it still had the original closets. You know what the closets were? They weren't like modern closets. They were deep, that you walk in and look around and there are these poles and everything hangs. No, no, no. The closets of this mid-19th century workers' home were about a foot deep. They were basically alcoves in the wall, little indentations with hooks. 5 or 6 hooks. And what you would do is you'd hang the clothing on the hooks because people didn't have many clothes. A couple of sets of trousers, one for Sunday best, one for everyday work. The Sunday best is turned into everyday work when you get a new Sunday best until that wears out and then you get a new Sunday best. Same with shirts. You've got maybe 2 shirts. If you're lucky, maybe you have a jacket or a sweater. People do not have much. Whereas today, storage space is very important in any modern home because we buy so much stuff. But in those days, it was not necessary. Also, people today, it's the poor people who live in most town centers or city centers. Wealthier people live in the suburbs. They have space around them. Not in those days. In those days, the factory owner had a beautiful house right next to the factory, right across the street, right across the canal. And the workers lived on the outskirts because everyone walked. So the closer you were to the factory, the more convenient it was. If you had a water wheel factory, there wasn't much pollution. When we started using coal for steam, that created a different impression. And when trolley systems were set up, which are like an early version of a railroad bus, the shift began to happen where wealthy people would set up around the periphery and the workers would end up closer to the factories. But at first it was the other way around because the owner had a greater commitment to the factory than any worker because it was his. The owner wanted to be there close enough so that at any moment he could hear what's going on and see what's going on in his factory. The managers were next to the owner, and then junior managers, and then workers going out in concentric circles. This is all new. This is all different. This is a society like no other. Industry creates a society that had never existed before in England, and eventually in Northwest Europe and New England in the United States. An industrializing society. And the shift that one makes from the traditional country world of throne, field, and altar, the lifestyle of a peasant or of a villager, somebody who's not in one of the heart of the modern cities. And even if they were in the heart of the modern cities, the so-called modern cities before industry were like Paris. They were not industrialized. That didn't happen until the early to mid-1800s. This was nothing that anyone had ever seen before. These gigantic buildings with their interconnected machines, where everyone was no longer the master of their own craft, but was reduced to a cog in a larger machine. And I'm going to show excerpts from a documentary on the history of the city of New York, where I was born, where my family is from, to illustrate this transition from the world that Julius Caesar or Jesus Christ could have recognized, which is the agrarian pre-industrial world, into a modern industrial metropolis, which is a journey that immigrants took in one boat ride in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You could have Jews from the Russian Pale go from life like Fiddler on the Roof in the shtetl, the rural Jewish ghetto, and suddenly they're in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the most modern, crowded place on earth at that time. Any questions before I go into it? I thought I saw your hand. Okay. So, I'm going to pause the video, hopefully I'll be able to do this. And I'll show you the clips. In all of that, for New York or America, read Industrialization. Now, there are things about New York at that time and the United States at that time that were unique. This is the time of the great 19th century migration's culmination. And between 1880 and 1925, huge numbers of people, millions of people, passed through New York City on their way to becoming Americans, including most of my ancestors. In 1925, the government, I think wisely, put the stops on immigration, slowed it down way much, so that those huge numbers of people that came here could be assimilated and become culturally more American. And that's what happened until the 1970s, when the doors were opened again, and they've been open wide since. But what they mean, there's an old saying that a nail that stands too high is inviting the hammer. One of the ways that my mother explained the brutality of her upbringing and the upbringing of her parents was that they were Irish. And in Kilkenny, Ireland, and in Waterford, Ireland, which are my maternal grandfather, or grandmother's mother and grandmother's father's people, my great-grandparents came from southeastern Ireland. If you stood out, the authorities would smack you down. So you learned to conform. And to this day, there is a distinction between, say, Irish Catholicism and Roman Catholic Catholicism, or Italian Catholicism. The Italians tend to be much more open, much more emotional, much more passionate. The Irish tend to be very cold and disciplined, and this is especially true 50 years ago and more, because the Irish learn the lessons of a conquered people. And the lessons of a conquered people are, don't stand out. Do your thing. Keep yourself private. Keep what you value hidden, so that it's not taken from you by the people who can take everything from you. Coming from that to a relatively open meritocracy is that those generations of unfulfillment personified. Irish become teachers, Irish become police officers, Irish become factory workers, business owners, bar owners, and everything else. And by the third generation, the Irish are indistinguishable from every other American. You know, there's a scene from the 1970s comedy about racism, Blazing Saddles. Yeah, we'll take the niggers and we'll take the chinks, but we won't take any Irish. And that is a quote from the movie, which is all about how horrible racism is. But the Irish were considered to be the worst of the lot by racists and by American, sort of nativists, because for whatever reason they were just seen as more violent and more angry than the blacks or than the Asians. In America, they had a chance to be something and someone other than who their parents were. They get a chance to define themselves by their actions, not by their heritage, not by their religion. And that, believe it or not, is true also for the Industrial Revolution and the cities. Yes?
Who conquered the Irish?
The English.
Oh.
Yeah. Back in Roman times and in the Dark Ages, the Irish raided England. Remember, St. Patrick was captured as a slave and brought from Britain to Ireland. But in the early first millennium, or second millennium AD, we're talking 11, 12, 1300s, 1400s, the English are beginning to encroach on Ireland. Now, Ireland is sort of this place, it's like the Armenia of northwestern Europe, or the Poland of northwestern Europe. Everyone who's anyone in that part of the world conquers Ireland or parts of it at one time or another. And the same is true of Poland, and the same is true of Armenia. The Romans don't conquer Ireland, but the Vikings do. It's list after list after list. Well, the English come in, and by 1500, the English have Ireland largely under its dominion. In the time of Oliver Cromwell, Ireland is spanked and spanked and spanked like a beaten dog. The Irish are basically ground down by this Protestant fanatic. And from the mid 1600s until the early 1900s, Ireland is under the strict rule of the British Empire. And while I am an Irish descendant who loves the British Empire, I have to admit that what they did in Ireland was some of their darkest work. In the modern world, in the industrial world, no one has time to worry about your background or your culture. Can you do the job? Are you able to keep up? Are you able to learn, adapt, change, function? And if you can do those things, you'll succeed. Industrialism brings meritocracy. It eliminates or at least blurs the lines of feudal social class. And it brings the opportunity for people at the bottom end of society to build up and become wealthy themselves, either by inventing something or investing in something. The thing about the free market is it's free. And anyone who works hard and anyone who invests wisely will usually be much better off for it. The difference, one of the reasons why one of the thousands of reasons why I'm a hardcore anti-communist is because communism doesn't work. In theory, it doesn't work. And one of the ways it doesn't work is that communism apportions what you're going to get as a resident of a communist country. They, being the powers that be, determine what your needs are, what your capabilities are, what your acceptable actions will be, what your range of choices are. In other words, you're a teenager forever, and then you die of old age. In the free market, no one defines you but you. No one limits your choices but you. In the free market, you can go from rags to riches. In the free market, you can think of something no one has ever thought of quite the same way before and make a boatload of money. Boatload, see, I said it that way. You're free to achieve. Now, as the water wheel is replaced by coal power, coal becomes the important part of a steam engine. Steam engines are based on water that is in some kind of closed-off chamber. And atop the chamber is a piston, which is connected to turning axle. And what happens is you light a fire under your chamber. And the thing about water is it takes a variety of forms depending upon the temperature. Obviously, if it's cold, below 32 Fahrenheit degrees or 0 degrees centigrade, you have a solidification of water into ice. But over the temperature of boiling, which is 212 Fahrenheit degrees, something like that, and 100 degrees centigrade, water becomes vaporous. So you have a fire, and the water begins to be converted to vapor. This much water requires this much space as vapor. So pressure begins to build up, and that pressure causes the piston to go up. Up here, there are vents, so that when the piston is at the top of its trajectory, the excess pressure is released and the piston goes down until the vapor pressure pushes it up again, goes down, and the up-down motion of the piston is going to turn an axle, which is going to create the same torsional energy that a water wheel will. You can put it anywhere. Now, at first they burnt wood and then they burnt charcoal, but the best source that they found was coal. Coal burns hotter, and there are two kinds of coal: anthracite and bituminous coal. I forget which is the good coal, but one of the coals is denser and it burns much hotter than the other. I don't remember if it's anthracite or bituminous. So what people begin to do is consume coal in vast amounts. Now, the United States is Saudi Arabia of coal. We have vast sums of coal. The British Isles had vast sums of coal. Northwestern Germany has vast sums of coal. The industrial regions of the world are situated where they are, not just because of waterfalls, like in New England, but because of coal. The presence of coal. But coal is solid. It is the result of the compression of the Carboniferous era forests. Carboniferous, remember, was a time when dragonflies were as wide as my arms outstretched because the oxygen content of the world was so great that lightning would actually combust the air itself, creating firestorms. So a lightning storm would be like an artillery barrage. And I showed you video of that last year from Walking with Monsters, yes.
Would that be like a pterodactyl?
But it's a dragonfly.
Yeah, but like, would a dragonfly be a pterodactyl?
No, pterodactyls are flying reptiles. They're flying lizards.
Oh, they'll have little like...
They have necks and little beaks, or not beaks, tooth mouths. And they've got bat-like wings and little hands.
Yeah, hands.
Yeah. So just to be clear, that era's biomass, dead plants, dead animals, now rests under various amounts of rock and earth, and they've been compressed into coal. So somebody's got to go down there and dig the coal out. And tomorrow what we're going to start with is the excerpts from George Orwell's book, The Road to Wigan Pier, which talks about his journeys as a reporter to the industrial north of England, Durham County and so forth, where a lot of England's coal was dug, and the communities of factory workers and coal miners that he visited. So we will do that tomorrow. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah.
In the chapter survey we just did,
Yep.
we read about child labor.
Yeah, kids, of course.
And like their descriptions of what would happen was terrifying.
Well, look, life was terrifying back then. You got to understand, kids worked everywhere.
Yeah.
And the thing about kids is you don't have to pay them as much, and they can fit into tight spaces.
And
So if there's a jam in one of the machines, you just attach it from the leather strap, and then you set some kids in. Little tiny hands. And if a few of them get injured, well, the adults could get injured too. It's just as dangerous. Well, this romanticization of childhood, where children are going to be treated like these porcelain dolls that need special nurturing and education, is so modern. It's a product of the industrial age. In the pre-industrial age, children were little adults, and you smack them around until they do what they're supposed to do. Yeah.
Like there was this one description of this kid who would be like strapped to a wood beam.
Yeah, because you don't want him wandering.
No, he would let me do it his work, and they like wouldn't get enough like supplies.
Yeah.
Because they were like, you need to go get your own stuff, but they didn't lower the quota for like how many stuff they could do, so they weren't making as much because they had to have to go get stuff for it.
Yeah.
And then when they wouldn't, this dude would strap him to a wood beam and feed him.
Yeah. That's right.
It doesn't make any sense.
It makes total sense.
No.
Children are workers. What do you think? Children are special? That they're our future? Stop! You're warm and touchy, munchy, crunchy idealist. That's you. You're just a liberal, progressive, tree-hugging person. Oh, because you don't believe in child. Do you know who opposed child labor more than everyone else? The families of the children who worked, because they brought income. And these do-gooder middle-class women, oh, child labor's wrong. We're going to deprive family of coin they needed to survive. Go.
You just called me a liberal?
Because you look, Haley, what you just in effect said, what you just said is, won't somebody please think of the children?
No. What I'm saying is,
yes, you do.
Does it make sense to send children out to go get
It makes total sense if you don't view childhood as some special sanctified state.
No, okay, because they was like, this guy was like, here, they used to give us the supplies, and now they don't give us the supplies.
Yeah.
They get the supplies.
Hey, look, if the kid was faster, he'd get enough supplies. He's got to compensate. He's got to compensate for his small stature and his weak little girly muscles. He's got to compensate. And the way he compensates is by working harder. And that beating is just a motivational technique.
Oh, of course. Till they die, it's fine.
Well, no, you don't want them dead. You just want them trained. Yes, trained.
Disabled?
That's well, hopefully not until they're too old to work.
Because literally, how do you tell somebody who's working in the coal mines? By their deformities.
Well, no, one of the ways you told them is by their gray pallor, because their skin, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, their skin absorbs the coal dust. Thank you. Have a nice day.
No, I mean, like, right now,